a lot of price gouging under the cover of tariffs, and there's a lot of economists running around claiming things are basically dangerous about tariffs when they don't know what they're talking about.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
We have on the line Lori Wallach. Lori is the director of Rethink Trade, a program of the American Economic Liberties Project. You can find her on Twitter at Wallach Lori. That's WLLACHLORI. And on Blue Sky at wallachlori.bsky.social. Really excited to have her on the program. I spoke to Lori a few years ago now. Gosh, I guess it was probably like 2022 or 2023 for a special stream that the Labor Radio Podcast Network did. I was doing it with Judy Ansell on the U.S.-Mexico trade agreement and like evaluating that a few years after. And I've been looking for, I've been wanting to get her on the Valley Labor Report sometime. And I've been seeing some really, really good analysis from Rethink Trade on the Trump administration's tariff policies. And I think that she's going to be a really great guest and somebody who's really going to be able to put things simply and help listeners understand what's going on. So, Lori Wallach, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, you're the director of Rethink Trade. The center of your work has been around trade policy. I mean, really for decades, if I'm not remembering incorrectly, and for decades, unions and many politicians on the left, particularly ones like Bernie Sanders, have been supportive of what some people would call protectionist sort of policies like tariffs. So before we get into the second Trump administration's implementation of tariffs, which I think most people can acknowledge at this point they have at least not been ideal. Whatever else you think of them, they could have been done better. Can you explain the case for tariffs as something that can be, if done correctly, beneficial for workers and the economy?
So tariffs are just a policy tool like anything else. I would never label them protectionist because that's sort of the naughty word that proponents of corporate trade have tried to put on people who want to have a trade system that's organized to benefit people and the planet, not just corporate profits. A tariff is a charge that is placed on a good. It doesn't apply to services, only to goods when it crosses a border. And there are a lot of very legitimate uses of tariffs. One of those is for enforcement. So if you, like most union members in the US and most Americans, believe there should be labor standards as a bottom, as a floor of decency in trade, no goods that are coming in from companies that bust unions or in violation of the labor standards in the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, which actually has enforceable labor standards, the thing you use as the sanction, the thing that you have hanging over the head of the bosses that are going to want to bust unions is, okay, you do that and your good is going to get penalized with a tariff. You can't do that. So it's used as an enforcement tool. Same thing for all of the folks who are very focused on the climate issue. When they talk about something called a border adjustment mechanism, a BAM. And that is basically using a tariff to equalize the cost of having environmentally sane policies become a cost in making a good. So in economic terms, they would say we're countering externalization of a cost by dumping on the planet. So those kinds of enforcement uses of tariffs, you equalize or punish against bad behavior. A second thing is for just flat out trade cheating. So at this point, our trade system, one of the few things Trump has right is that the global trade system is so imbalanced that no one is really getting the benefits of it as far as working people. There are now about 20 countries in the world that have chronic global trade surpluses. Every year, they send a lot more to other countries than they buy. And you'd think like, oh, China, at least the workers there are doing well. But the way they get those benefits, the way that they get that imbalance is they suppress wages and they suppress consumption, and or they use huge honking subsidies that make it absolutely impossible to compete no matter how hard and smart everyone in the other countries works, or they manipulate the currency to bring down the value of the currency. And then when you trade it off into dollars, it basically makes their good unrealistically cheap. So for flat out trade cheating, sometimes those kinds of policies are called mercantilism. You use a tariff to equalize the cheating or sometimes to just shut out the cheating stuff. And then the third use of tariffs is as part of industrial policy. So sometimes, even if there's not cheating, if there's not bad behavior, as a country, you decide, hey, we can't be a country, or we are dangerously exposed. We need to increase our resilience. Footnote, we all saw how that worked out when the most powerful country in the world couldn't make the basic things we needed to keep our families safe during COVID. So yeah, we should actually put up some tariffs, not total, but some, on imports of, say, you pick the things that are important, but medicine, things we need for infrastructure like iron and steel and aluminum, or transportation equipment or communications equipment. We have to make microchips. We have to make cell phones, whatever it is, things that you as a continental sized country would want to be able to make. You leave a little bit of your market open for international trade. You leave a little bit of your market protected for domestic manufacturers. But you combine those tariffs, which are the defense that are giving you a little space in your own market to occupy it and generate domestic demand. You combine that with other policies. So you do tax credits for consumers to get us to buy the domestic stuff. You do tax credits for manufacturers to build new plants. You make it cheaper to build new plants than to invest. You do the worker training to get the workforce ready to do it. You do a surround policy because we're going to make more medicine in the US. And then you also diversify your import sources, and that's how you build resilience. So those are the three legitimate uses of tariffs. And just footnote, if you go to our website, tradewatch.org, there's a bunch of materials about tariffs. There's a whole part of the website about tariffs, but we explain how during the Biden administration, at least for certain things, EV vehicles, solar energy, iron and steel and aluminum, basically this kind of combo policy where the tariffs keep out some of the imports to create space as a defense, but then you do all the other stuff with taxes, with investment policy, worker training, et cetera. That actually got us, ladies and gentlemen, the biggest rate of investment in factories in the United States of America by 2023 that had been in 30 years. In 30 years. So it can work, but it's not the answer just by itself, and it's got to be targeted and strategic.
Right. I mean, I wish, what is the name of that graph? Because I know the graph that you're thinking of, and it is genuinely a shocking graph to see how much more investment the Biden administration was getting, or was that kind of says that it's the Biden administration doing it the way that I phrased that. And maybe it was, but whatever happened, there was a shocking amount of increased investment in manufacturing in 2023.
Slope increase. Yeah, it was like, that is on our website, rethinktrade.org. And if you go to our tariff section, there is a slideshow in there, and that graphic is in there. There's also, that graphic is in a little memo that says the legitimate uses of tariffs.
Yes, I mean, I recommend folks doing that because it is a wild graph, and it's wild to see those numbers falling now as we're increasing tariffs. And you know, so we're a union radio program. We're union members. We have, you know, folks from the UAW and the steelworkers on pretty regularly, and so obviously the labor issue is the kind of key thing for us. It's the one that we're most focused on, and you know, economists, you know, will respond to folks like me, and they'll say, oh, look, there's an opportunity cost, you know, like some countries can just build cars more cheaply than us, and so it's better if we allow them to produce cars more cheaply, and then we get the benefit of those cheap cars. And it's like, you know, it would be one thing if, like, just for some reason, you know, the soil in Mexico was like better for producing vehicles or something, and that's the case like with respect to coffee, right? I mean, very few places in the country in the United States that you can produce coffee, and so it makes sense for us to get coffee from other places. But the reason that most that most of the imports that are so cheap is because they're produced with people who are making literally pennies on the dollar of what an American worker can make, and so like, why should we allow that? Like, why should we incentivize other countries to exploit their people for our cheap consumption? I mean, it's not good for anybody. And actually, we've seen the UAW has done some really great research on automotive wages in Mexico, and the average auto worker in Mexico today, the economist theory of the case would be that, okay, sure, Mexican workers are going to make less than American workers do right now, but if you allow that investment to happen, then over time, they're going to reach parity with American workers. Well, literally, actually, the opposite has happened. Mexican workers now make less than they did before NAFTA was passed. And so, the whole thing is really just a bunch of nonsense. And that's why, unions and some people on the left have been supportive of tariffs for a long time. And you mentioned the Biden administration's use of tariffs along with other policies. Tariffs from the first Trump administration. Actually, I think most people at this point see them as a good use of the tool. Certainly by unions in the Biden administration kept all of Trump 1's tariffs and increased them in many cases. Why did they work? And I think the spoiler alert is that the tariffs that are going on right now are probably not having the intended effect. Why did the ones from the first administration work while the ones from the second administration are maybe having more of a detrimental impact?
So I want to say something about the first administration first, which is, yes, those tariffs worked for what they were supposed to do, which was to bring down our bilateral trade deficit with China. And that is, China was able to send directly to the United States less stuff because there were tariffs on $350 billion worth of stuff that was sold from China. But because the first Trump administration had people like Treasury Secretary Mnuchin saying, I hate tariffs, yay, free trade. And, oh, cheap wages, yeah, let's bust those unions. They were unable to do the rest of the policy, which is, for instance, except for Mexico and Canada and the USMCA, they weren't able to, for instance, have a floor of wages or labor standards required across the boat. And so what happened is what we call the squeeze the balloon factor, which is the trade deficit with China went down about $200 billion, which is great. Unfortunately, trade deficit with Mexico at the same time went up $100 billion. By the way, not only are Mexican wages lower than they were before NAFTA for auto workers, but the Mexican manufacturing wage is considerably lower than China's. Most people don't realize that because the Mexican government has been for 50 years actively busting unions and putting in protection unions to make a deal with the boss. The workers don't even know there's a collective bargaining agreement. It's one that's for the boss to keep wages down. And then there's a big fight whenever someone wants an independent union. It's a mess. So we saw a $100 billion increase in the deficit with Mexico, a $120 billion increase with the deficit with Vietnam. So China was basically either investing in the Chinese companies, which are very closely associated with the government, were either investing in Mexico and Vietnam or just figuring out ways to transship to have some final process done in assembling stuff, and then it gets stamped Vietnam or it gets stamped Mexico instead of China, and then it dodges around the tariffs. Plus, there was this huge loophole called de minimis that was recently closed, but that was allowing hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese stuff to slip in without being counted. So that's the caveat in the first term. As great as some of that progress was, and there was real progress, there were, caveats there because the trade guys were genius, but the, old corporate Republican classic guys were there pushing back.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
Before we get to the second term, I wanted to put a question to you on the first term tariffs, because this is something that I hear a lot. And I think that my position is pretty clear. I'm supportive, certainly, of the first term tariffs. But, some economists will respond to that, particularly on the steel tariffs, that yes, the steel tariffs increased steel jobs by some number in the United States, but they decreased other advanced manufacturing jobs by more, because the steel that was produced by virtue of the fact that we had tariffs on other countries, the steel that was produced in the United States, which is a component part for manufacturing, like John Deere tractors and vehicles and stuff, because that component part, the steel, increased, we produced less cars and tractors and blah, blah, blah than we would have otherwise. And so we actually ended up killing more manufacturing jobs than we saved because of those steel tariffs. What do you make of that? Is there anything to that?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because there are two big myths about tariffs in the first Trump term. That's one of them. And the reality is, a lot of the stuff that got blamed on tariffs had to do both with manufacturing, but also prices. Because the other thing you hear all the time, the second big myth is, oh, those Trump tariffs raise prices. And both of those myths are not what the data show. So first of all, the thing to understand is that a bunch of these companies like John Deere are looking for excuses to offshore, to Mexico, to Vietnam, to wherever. And so they were just looking for an excuse to be able to increase their profit margin. They had plenty of room to be able to pay the relatively small increase in what it cost them to have steel or aluminum. They were not being put out of business. And instead, they just decided to use that excuse to offshore. Same thing with prices. There's a ton of price gouging that's happening under the cover of claiming it's a tariff. And let me just tell you one that everyone heard during Trump 1, washers and dryer prices. Why not? Because of the tariffs on aluminum. Well, friends, there were never any tariffs on dryers. Sorry, there were direct tariffs on washing machines. And there were no tariffs on steel or aluminum in Canada. Yet the prices on washers and dryers, something not tariffed, went up in Canada, not just in the US, because the companies were marketing and could use that excuse for price gouging. They raised the prices on both of them way beyond whatever small increment the tariffs would have added to washing machine aluminum. So in that instance, there's just a lot of baloney floating out there. And right now, we're kind of seeing that, where you have companies that have said, oh, we don't have to raise the price, we can deal with it. Well, the reason they're basically admitting that there is a huge markup. So let me just give you one example of how the tariff price thing works, because there's a lot of obsession with prices and it's ignorant. And the economists must not be listened to, because they don't even understand what's tariffed and what's not. Because, for instance, in the Trump 2 tariffs, there are exceptions on certain things. And so, just for instance, remember how the prices of fresh vegetables and fruits went up in the producer price index in August? Everyone's like, ooh, that's the tariffs. The tariffs exclude fresh fruits and vegetables from Mexico. Everyone said that's Mexican tariffs. That's tariffs on Mexico. There's an exclusion for fresh fruits and vegetables. So there's just a lot of confusion. But here's the thing. Take that $120 pair of Nike shoes. A tariff is charged on the wholesale price, the price the thing comes in for. Because of all the labor violations, no independent unions in Vietnam where all that stuff's made, dumping on the environment, those shoes cost. The retailer pays at wholesale about $21 for the shoes they're going to market at $120 to us. Okay, there's some cost for transporting it, for the retail store, whatever. But they have a ginormous $100 plus markup. Now, let's just say there's a 30% tariff. There isn't, but let's just say there's a 30% tariff. It's charged on the $21. So that adds $7. So now you've got a $28 cost for a sneaker that you're going to sell for $120. It is a choice if you're going to raise those prices, because you still have a huge profit markup and you have picked that $120 price because you know that's how you're going to sell the most of them. So there's a lot of price gouging under the cover of tariffs. And there's a lot of economists running around claiming things are basically dangerous about tariffs when they don't know what they're talking about.
Right. I appreciate that. And that's why I wanted to put that to you, because I knew you'd have a good answer. And so let's talk about the effects of the second Trump administration's use of tariffs? What's been happening? And, as you answer that, can you talk specifically to, the jobs reports that we just saw, the second one of last week, which has been really, really bad? Are these the results of the second Trump administration's tariff policies?
So, as I was saying, the Trump administration to tariff policies are just like malpractice. Everything you can think of not to do with the tariff they've done, and then they've come up with a few ones I'd never thought of before. The main thing you have to have with the tariff is you have to have stability and predictability. You are trying to send a signal to companies: invest in making stuff here, invest in building new factories, invest in hiring and training workers. We can rely on the US market being there for you because we've got these tariffs to protect some piece of the market. This is what you're going to know your future is. Go ahead and come here and set up a new factory. That is what the Biden folks did in early on, saying this is what the rate's going to be, and here are some tax credits to do the right thing. Instead, there have been these off and on tariffs that are just, loopy, so you can't predict anything. Some of the plants that were under construction from the previous administration have halted construction. Our friends from the building trades will tell us, because there's so much uncertainty about what the rate will be the next day. I mean, think about all the changes. It's on, it's off, it's up, it's down. So that's number one. Number two, you don't tariff all the countries at the same time. You sequence stuff and you figure out what the supply chain is, so that, for instance, you might start out with the highest tariffs on finished goods, but you have no tariffs or lower tariffs in the beginning on imported parts. Because you're going to need, if you're going to have domestic manufacturing until your supply chain gets built domestically, you need an exception system. Not forever, but a couple of years to get the part to go into the factory that you're building to make it here. Number three, you figure out what countries you want to hit. At this point, as I mentioned, there are about 20 countries that have all these mercantilist practices, that have huge honking surpluses with the whole world. China's by far the biggest, by far, but Germany is second. They're trading under the euro, so that's not their real currency value. They get the benefit of basically having the European currency have a bucket of much cheaper currencies in there, so they get that subsidy. But they also have a very high level VAT tax, which suppresses consumption. And there's been bad union busting in Germany. So Germany used to be like the ideal of how to do it right with manufacturing. They're having a lot of manufacturing exports, but by doing it wrong. There's some other countries you'd expect: Japan, Korea, Taiwan. Those are countries that have historically manipulated currency, used big subsidies, et cetera. Meanwhile, in the rest of the world, not just the US, which by far has the biggest, we have $1 trillion annual trade deficit. And as predicted by economists, that's deindustrialized us. We have lost more than 5 million net manufacturing jobs just in the last 20 years. So huge gutting. And that scenario is now happening to a lot of other countries. There's 65 other countries in the world that have chronic trade deficits with the world. So, countries you wouldn't expect: Brazil, Mexico, India. It's become a crisis in countries around the world to have this imbalanced system. So what you would do is you would target the countries that are causing the problem, and you would not penalize the countries that are in the same boat of having a deficit. You would set labor standards as a condition for coming into the market, environmental standards as a condition for coming into the market. You'd lift up the standards for both salaries, wages, and health for workers around the world that way. Livelihoods would improve. But instead of doing that, the Trump administration has basically done tariffs because they, are in solidarity with the right-wing coup leader someplace. That's Brazil. 50% tariffs on Brazil, because Trump is mad that the Brazilian justice system is working and they're having actually a trial for a failed coupster. He's probably thinking that could have been me. So because he's in solidarity with the former right-wing lunatic who was the president of Brazil, he's put tariffs up. We have a trade surplus with Brazil. We send them more stuff than we buy. Why would we be hitting Brazil? Meanwhile, he's cut the tariffs on automobile imports from Japan, Korea, and Germany. A huge part of our imbalance in autos, it's down to 15%. You can go to the UAW's website for a very strong news release about the Japan tariffs in that regard. Meanwhile, there are 25% tariffs on the cars coming from Mexico and Canada. the one set of trade rules that have labor standards. So the US-Mexico-Canada agreement actually has labor standards. Our auto manufacturing is very integrated in North America. Those cars get a 25% tariff, but with no labor standards, no environmental standards, none of the other rules to try and protect the North American worker, the cars from Germany, Korea, and Japan get 15%. How does that possibly make sense? So that's why I'm saying in the sort of malpractice, it's not just that they're not doing it enough. They're actually doing it wrong in a lot of ways that you're getting the fallout. So you mentioned the data. Again, on rethinktrade.org, on our website, right up in the top, actually, you can see a memo we did with the data, not just the jobs data. So we're down 78,000 manufacturing jobs since the beginning of the Trump administration. That's January through July of 2025, down 78,000 manufacturing jobs. But also, if you look at all the manufacturing indexes, so things like are plant managers buying stuff in supply chain? What is investment? What are projections? There are 3 or 4 ones that are government or private sector. We have all those compiled, and all of those are declining for manufacturing. And a lot of that we hear, from interviews in the press, is just companies having so much uncertainty. They don't know what the heck is going to happen. So they're not investing. They're not hiring. They're basically sitting on their hands waiting to find out what happens next day.
Yeah, it's seems bad. We're we're running out of time, so I don't. The last question that I was going to ask you is what does a positive trade policy look like? I think that folks can glean some of that from what you've been saying today, and they'll be able to go to rethinktrade.org, and maybe we can get you back on the program just to talk, prescriptively, like what should the Trump administration be doing. But instead of ending with that, I want to end with this. I'm concerned, really concerned about the prospect of negative outcomes from the Trump administration's tariff policy, which, like you said, it's just a tool, like a hammer. A hammer can be a very productive piece of equipment. You can put some nails in, and it's great. And you can also kill people with it, right? And so you can't judge, what happens by the use of the hammer. You can't judge the hammer by what happens from the use of it. Same thing with the tariffs. But I'm really concerned about the bad outcomes negatively polarizing Democratic politicians and Democratic voters, and even some section of the Republican voters and politicians against tariffs completely, because they'll look back and they'll say, well, look, Trump tried tariffs and we got screwed. So, maybe the people who were the free traders were right all along, and that's what we need in an attempt to, separate themselves from Trump and attempt to reinstate the free trade status quo. How realistic is that concern, and what can folks like you and me and unions and folks on the left do to try to make that not happen?
So, Jacob, I think that's a realistic concern. It's one I share. And that's because, the corporate lobby and all the sort of neoliberal thinkers are always lurking out there looking for an excuse to try and claw back their way. Their system failed miserably. It has devastated working America. It's devastated the environment. It's just been a catastrophe, and the data is compelling. So they're in the wilderness, and they're thinking, this might be like a line out of hell for us. The things that we can do, number one, folks, it's so important to talk to your members of Congress. I cannot underscore how uninformed many members of Congress are, because there hasn't been a big trade fight in the U.S., like a national knockdown dragout, frankly, since the Trans-Pacific Partnership a decade ago. There was a sizable skirmish over the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the renegotiation of NAFTA. So many members of Congress, more than half of the Democrats now in office, were not here, even for the USMCA fight, much less the TPP. So they don't know the basics. And so what they're hearing is this sort of beltway, pundity, smart people, too many economists, tariffs, raise prices. Instead of understanding what we ought to be focusing on is making stuff in this country and raising wages so people can pay for things made under the kind of conditions we want to live in. So we want to raise the wages and the environmental standards and the cost to the bosses of those kind of inputs around the damn world. It's not like we're saying, oh, everyone else out there can live in hell. The whole theory of what's a good trade policy is it's a trade policy that conditions the access into the lucrative markets like the US as a pull-up mechanism for the whole damn world. And so we need to remind them it's not just about prices. Footnote, tariffs don't always increase prices, but it's about having good jobs, making things that your neighbors, fellow Americans need. It's for our resilience and national security, as well as for economic equality. And we must understand why these things are so cheap, because it's forced labor, it's abused labor, it's dumping toxics on the environment. Educating those members of Congress to say to them, you know something, when you just beat on tariffs, you make me hate Democrats. They literally need to hear this. And by the way, there's a strong line of these folks. I recommend Google up a great op-ed from the New York Times written by a guy from Pennsylvania named Congressman Chris DeLuzio. He lays it out just flat out, like we need to be nuanced. Tariffs are a tool. You use them right, we get good benefits. Let's not sound like boneheads. So that's number one. Number two thing is we have this grand opportunity right now to try and enunciate what we're for and contrast it with Trump. Because part of the story here is we have to show what he's doing is not the proper future of trade. It's not what we're for. It's not like either you can have NAFTA or you can have Trump tariffs. What we're for is a different thing. And the way to make that clear is to contrast what he's doing and why it's not working. So they're about to be, starting October 4th probably, notice to start a big comment period and renegotiation and review period for that US-Mexico-Canada agreement. And if you go to the Citizens Trade Campaign, citizenstrade.org, that's the big national coalition of unions, family farm, faith, consumer, and other groups, they're doing a petition where everyone can help put in those comments. I've got it automated to say, here's what we want when the USMCA, the NAFTA replacement, gets renegotiated. Because that's an opportunity for unions, Democrats to say, like, yo, Trump, you want to actually do something on trade that helps working people? Fix this stuff in this agreement. You said this agreement was going to end the trade deficit, end offshoring to Mexico. It did not. More offshoring is going on. Trade deficit's $100 billion bigger. Here's what you need to do to actually fix that. Please, that is an affirmative way, Mr. President, to do it right. Of course, he's not going to agree because those are the things that are good for workers in the planet as compared to his corporate buddies. But that is a really useful thing to be engaging in. And then number three, for everyone I'm from Wausau, Wisconsin, north central Wisconsin, all my high school friends, half of whom voted for Trump, more than half probably. When I'm having a discussion with them, I also point out the jump, and everyone should do this with their friends who voted for Trump, the distance between what he promised versus what's happening. So he promised he'd be using tariffs to increase U.S. manufacturing, both to get us more good union jobs, manufacturing jobs, but also for our resilience and national security. We just need to make more stuff here. It's absurd. We have a continental-sized country with all of these brilliant working people with so many skills, all these natural resources that can be turned into stuff, and we're importing everything we need. That's just crazy. That is not an act of God. That is bad policy. So he agreed that he was going to do these things that, reasonable people across the political spectrum would say is the right way to go. Instead, you know who's been getting the best use of these tariffs? Big tech. He's using these tariffs like a stick to threaten our allies, like in Europe or like in Korea, to say, if you don't get rid of those rules for online privacy, if you don't get rid of those anti-monopoly rules for big tech, if you don't, you have an app store rule where the monopolies can't just charge app developers and consumers a ridiculous amount for access to stuff they need. If you don't get rid of that, I'm going to hit you with another tariff. Big tech dudes who are at the White House just literally Thursday night for a Rose Garden private dinner, all those oligarchs sitting there, those tech bros, they're the ones who are getting the benefit of the tariffs. Meanwhile, like our friends at the UAW with their news release about the Japan deal, working people are getting screwed, as you can see, by 78,000 less manufacturing jobs. Telling that story and just sending folks actually to the data. I mean, ironically, there are some of the most Trumpy of the Trumpsters, like Steve Bannon, who's been making the same point. Like, why the hell are these tariffs helping big tech as compared to helping working people in manufacturing? Hate to quote Steve Bannon, but on this one, he happens to be right. And that contrast is something that's definitely worth talking to your friends just over a drink after work about, who voted for Trump, about, hey, ask them, do you have a plan to get this guy back on track? Because right now he's not using his tariffs for us. He's using it for big tech.
Lori Wallach, director of the Rethink Trade Program at American Economic Liberties Project. You can find her on Twitter at Wallach Lori and Blue Sky at wallachlori.bluesky.social. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it, and hope to get you back on again.
Thank you, Jacob. Appreciate being invited. Bye-bye.
All right.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.